As a 90s kid growing up in Eastern Europe, my childhood was full of stories, some of which were cringeworthy, some hilarious, but some still managed to give me chills, especially now that I fully realized the potential harm that I was facing back then. I had several instances when I got pretty close to being in real danger, but here I've picked only two of the most prominent ones because I don't want to bore you guys with too long of a story, and because those two are imprinted in my mind, and weirdly, still very vivid with every detail. So, I was 10 years old, and it was a hot summer day at noon, and I was allowed to play in front of my apartment building with other kids, but I always had to stay where my mum could peek from the window to see me. On this day, maybe because it was noon and most of the other children were still having lunch or a nap, on the playground it was just me and an 8-year-old boy, drawing with chalk on the ground. There weren't many people on the streets, but I remember noticing a man in his 20s walking past us, and I didn't pay much attention to him at first until I noticed that he started to stop and turned to look at us a few times. But then he went away, so I just kept drawing. Some time passed, and I suddenly saw a pair of male shoes standing next to where I was crouched down, and when I looked up, I saw that it was that same man. He looked around and then asked the boy to go a little further away because he wanted to tell me a secret. The boy obliged, and I was left alone with the stranger. I remember that he was staring at me, and even though he was smiling, there was some undercurrent of tension in his whole demeanor, which made me feel a bit uneasy. He leaned down, propping his hands on his knees, and I don't exactly recall what he said at first because I was looking around to see if anyone I knew was around, but then he asked me if I liked kittens. My eyes lit up and I immediately perked up, saying yes, and then he said that he knew where a mother cat with her litter of kittens was and asked if I wanted to see them. I immediately stood up, my uneasiness and all the stranger danger warnings immediately dissolving at the prospect of kittens. My mum didn't allow pets at home. He told me to follow him, and I did, him walking in front of me and me behind, until I saw that he was actually going towards one of the 4 entrances of the apartment building. Back then, the front doors of those buildings, they weren't locked, and neither were the entrances to the basement areas, which were on the inside, next to the main door. He entered the building and started to descend down the staircase leading to the basement area, and that is when some form of self-preservation instinct started to kick in and made me hesitate at the doorstep. He was already on the last step down the basement when he turned to check if I was following and beckoned me with a cheerful,
"Come on, hurry up."
I took a few more hesitant steps in, and he continued further into the basement corridor, where it was very dark behind you, humid and a putrid smell of mold lingered. I could see half of him, the rest of him hidden behind the corner of the wall. But then I heard a metal click sound. I was starting to descend down the stairs. I know, I cringe at my own stupidity when I remember it too. When he peeked again, half of him still hidden from my sight, but the visible half revealed his belt buckle dangling unbuckled. And then he came out a little more and his hand moved, drawing my eyes down where I saw, yeah, you guessed it. His pants were unzipped and he was looking at me, and I still remember the expression in his eyes. I wanted to scream, but I was honestly so shocked that I had a deer in the headlights moment before he took a step up towards me, and finally I felt the sudden adrenaline rush kicking in. At one moment I was standing frozen, the next I was running out of there with the speed of light. I didn't even turn to see if he was following. All I knew was that I had to get the hell out of there. I climbed my stairs to my apartment, which was 2 entrances away from this one, just in time to bump into my very worried mum, who was putting her shoes on to go out and look for me, worried sick because apparently the last time she peeked through the window, she didn't see me, shouted my name a few times and got no answers, so she had an unsettling feeling that something was wrong. She asked me what happened, and at first I didn't tell her because I was ashamed and scared that she would get even angrier if she found out I was even talking to a stranger, let alone about following him. I started feeling anxious after that and eventually admitted to what happened to my mum. Needless to say, I was given an earful of lectures and wasn't allowed to play without adult supervision until years later. The second prominent story was when I was 12, and thinking back now, compared to today's 12-year-olds being so outspoken and street smart, I was a totally clueless kid still. I remember I was feeling insecure and self-conscious at the time because puberty had hit as if overnight, and my previously scrawny little body was beginning to form curves, which also prompted unwanted attention from teenage boys, and even older men at the age of my dad, taking notice of me when I walked past them. It was during the spring vacation when my mum, my aunt, and my cousin, he was male and 13, and I went to the amusement park in the city. My cousin was riding a bumper car, and I was sitting on a bench with my mum and aunt when I spotted a man setting a big tin pot at the alley leading to the park, and I immediately started pleading with my mum to give me money because I knew what he was selling: boiled corn on the cob. Now, keep in mind that back then, nobody seemed to care about checking health and sanitary permissions of street vendors, and it was a very common sight to see a little ice cream stand and old lady sitting on a chair with a pot next to them selling boiled corn on cob or cotton candy or something. My mum sent me to buy 4 corns on cobs for each of us, and I headed towards the man, my mouth already watering. When I approached him and ordered, however, I noticed that he hesitated and gave me a very unsettling once-over from head to toe, and then, without even opening the pot to check, he declared that there weren't enough corn in there. I thought that was weird, considering that I just spotted him coming, which logically was supposed to mean that he had a full pot of corn, but didn't say anything because I was shy and awkward, and it would have never even occurred to me to question an adult like that, especially a stranger. He quickly added that his car was parked at the nearby parking lot, which was right behind the alley leading to the amusement park, and told me that if I wanted to, I should follow him to retrieve another spare pot from his trunk. I looked back at the park and thought that the parking lot was still close enough and it shouldn't be a problem, so, relieved that I will, after all, get my corn, I followed him. He picked the pot and walked carrying it towards his car with me walking a few steps behind, and he was just opening the trunk to put the pot inside when 2 things happened simultaneously. My hand was abruptly grabbed by my aunt, who shook me and started questioning my sanity for walking away with a stranger, then shouting at the man for being crazy to suggest to a child to follow him to a car, and I caught a glimpse of the trunk, and inside was no other pot of corn but the one he had just put inside. Now, at that point, I was still confused, and frankly, I'm ashamed to admit that I was even a little annoyed at my aunt for overreacting because I still wanted my corn and didn't understand what the big deal was, until my train of thought was interrupted. What happened next still makes the hair on my neck stand on ends. Instead of clarifying the situation, giving any semi-reasonable explanation, or even attempting to respond in any way, the man suddenly rushed to close the trunk, ran into his car, and then took off in such a hurry that the tires made those screeching noises from the rapid acceleration. My aunt and I just stood there dumbfounded. It suddenly dawning on us what appeared to be an innocent yet cautionary situation was actually a very real potential kidnap attempt. Because if there had been any reasonable doubt before as to why the man would lure a 12-year-old girl alone towards his car, his following reaction of fleeing the scene had left no room for it. My aunt visited us recently, and that incident was brought up somehow, so she said that she still remembers how what drew her attention at first was the fact that the man was unusually dressed up for a street vendor, and so she was watching closely with a weird gut feeling at first. When she saw that he was taking me towards the parking lot, she sprinted into action. And thank God my aunt, being a PE teacher and a mother of a very wild boy, was wearing sneakers and was always prepared to jump into action. Because that day, I could have gone missing.